After a conflict, armies often ended up with a lot of enemy materials, and what to do with them but to expose them in order to show the might of the victor. If military museums can be found even in ancient Rome, those who have survived today come mostly from Renaissance, such as the Royal Armoury in Stockholm, that exposes the different conquests of King Gustav Adolphus and Karl XII. But it is mostly with the First and Second World War that major museums emerge, such as the Tank Museum in Kubinka or other many museums you can find in France. However, concerning Japan, museums are quite late in history. It will be only in the Meiji era that major museums were to be created, such as the Kahaku in Ueno, which expose not only scientific pieces but also historical pieces, not to mention the many prefectural museums found all over Japan. However, because of mostly American occupation, many important Japanese historical material disappeared. For example, many swords or some plain prototype from the Second World War disappeared. Therefore, there are not many war museums left in Japan. However, those who are left are quite interesting to understand on how Japanese memory works. And that's what we are going to see in this new episode of Mukashi. The Battle of Tsushima not only marked a major victory for Japan on the strategic side with the sinking of Russian Baltic Fleet, but it also represented a moral victory, the victory of a smaller country against the largest land empire in the world. Thus, its heroes were revered. And if last time we have seen that Admiral Togo was divinized, its ship was also treated with a special regard. Mikasa is a battleship made in the UK for Japan. After the Battle of Tsushima, Mikasa participated in some naval exercises, but most importantly in the Siberian intervention against Communist Russia. The Naval Treaty of Washington in 1922 would sign the end of life for Mikasa. However, instead of the ship being scrapped like many other ships of the era, Mikasa was simply encasted in concrete in order to never be used again for war purposes. The creation of such memorial ship was a sign for Japan that it was a great power, a power capable of emerging victorious against even larger foes. Sadly for Mikasa, the American occupation and its anti-militarism led to the near destruction of the memorial ship. It was then converted in a ballroom and an aquarium, leaving Japan without much symbol of its victories. However, in the 60s, collectioner and most importantly Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was a great friend of Admiral Togo, decided to try to renovate the museum. The task was quite difficult as many of the parts that made Mikasa were scrapped. However, thanks to major conservation efforts and cannibalization of other ships, it was possible to restore the once mighty ship. Nowadays the ship stands in Yokosuka port near Sarujima, and it is a place of memory not only for Japanese former military might, but also an open door for other countries. Thanks to Chester Nimitz's efforts and later the crew of his aircraft carrier. The ship was well maintained, and nowadays it is one of the last battleships that you can visit in the world. And on the other side of the world you can also visit battleship Aurora, which was an opponent of Mikasa during the Battle of Tsushima. Mikasa may be a symbol of victory over Russia. The enemy of Japan are not seen as negative during the exhibition, and quite the contrary, especially with paintings of Admiral Togo appearing friendly with Admiral Zivoni Rojesvensky. Every year you can go to this museum to enjoy a free concert as well as a conference on the 27th of May. Finally, contrary to other museums in Japan, this one has next to no controversy, but we will see that it's not always the case for other museums. When speaking about Japanese War Museum, one place is unavoidable, and unfortunately it is probably one of the most controversial places in Japan. Inside the shrine of Yasukuni in Tokyo you can find the well-known Yushukan. But first it is important to understand why Yasukuni exists. Contrary to many ancient shrines, Yasukuni is pretty recent in Japanese history. It was built to honor soldiers who went down for the Japanese Empire from the Meiji Restoration to the end of Second World War. This means that around 2 million people are enshrined in this place. And while military cemetery in any country are not particularly controversial, this place is known for mostly one event. In the 70s, private religious authorities enshrined some of the accused in the Tokyo trial, such as Hideki Tojo. However, having such a few number of controversial figures, over 2 million, is not why Yasukuni Shrine is seen as controversial the most nowadays. What creates the most tension is the museum near the shrine, the Yushukan. While most of what you can find in this museum is pretty objective, the facts presented here are often debatable to say the least, especially on how Japanese expansionism is turned into a defense against colonialism. Personally, even if this museum can have some revisionist takes, I think it is still interesting, not only for the value of historical pieces where you can find rare Japanese tanks, but also it is useful to understand how Japanese historical sphere thinks in its most revisionist parts. Of course, this is not a must-see if you are attached to historical truth, but I think understanding this point of view helps finding it. Something not so well known about Japan are the case of Siberian detainees, and especially their fate in Russian Gulag. After the end of the war, and especially during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, many Japanese soldiers were captured by Soviet Union and sent to labor camps. And sadly, as it is often the case in history, this fate is seen as deserved by non-historians, sadly. Therefore, the suffering of these soldiers are often ignored by general population outside of Japan, and even in Japan it is not a well-known fact. Moreover, any attempts of Honoring their memories can be often seen as revisionist, whereas this is well documented from not only Japanese perspective but also from Russian historians themselves. In Shinjuku you can find a museum that pays tribute to this period of history. The entry is free and you can not only see letters of soldiers here, but also how they lived inside of Russian Gulag. The living conditions were indeed harsh. Although they are not comparable to other concentration camps, still many died during detention, almost two-thirds of Japanese captured soldiers. This fate was also shared by soldiers on German Eastern Front, and especially for forced incorporated such as Malgré-Nous in Alsace-Moselle. There have been a recent adaptation of this story, and this is not only important for Japanese memory but also on the side of Russia, as one of the last co-production between the two countries was also around prisoner of war, this case in the Russo-Japanese War. The song you are hearing was created by Tadashi Masayoshi from Ibaraki Prefecture, and you can also visit a museum dedicated to his work in the same prefecture. If the Museum for Peace in Shinjuku was dedicated to military victims of the Second World War, the two cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima are museum cities dedicated to civilians victims of Japan. As you may know, those two cities were destroyed by an atomic bombing on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. The whole city still bears damage of this destruction, not only in its stone but also in its flesh, with Hibakusha being survivors of the two bombings. The most well-known monument here is Genbaku Dome, which was an exhibition hall before its destruction. It represents not only the devastation created by scientific minds but also the resilience of Japan. The building was not fully destroyed by the explosion. There are also the two peace parks in both cities dedicated to the victims and where commemoration happen every year. The two cities also have museums dedicated to the victims of the bombing themselves, presenting not only the damage but also the radioactive contamination. The cities itself are some kind of educative by their own presence, a reminder that no country should ever use the atomic bomb again. After visiting this city, it is very difficult to support any sorts of military industries, honestly, and it is the kind of visit that changes you forever, thus making these cities not only memorials by themselves but also a living museum of the nuclear devastation. This approach is quite different from other cities, however, such as Oradour-sur-Glane, who have kept the damage of the war. After such a traumatic war, promoting the army in any sense was seen as extremely negative in Japan and is seen as negative by Japanese even still nowadays. Therefore, for the newly formed Japanese Self-Defense Forces, it was quite difficult to find a legitimacy past its use as a police force during its creation. Therefore, quite a few museums are dedicated to them, and the only time you can really see them are when they are doing maneuvers on their bases during open door days. This is also due to the fact that Japanese Self-Defense Force don't have much to expose. They were not involved in major conflict, and even their materials is not always very impressive to show to the public. That was the case before recent years, where Japan boasting his force a bit more. Japanese Self-Defense Force exhibitions are quite rare, but you can find a permanent one in the Information Center in Tokyo. Here not only goodies are being sold, but many still in use pieces of Japanese Defense Forces are being exposed. Also, an important point is that the museum is entirely free. Past the exposition of Japanese tanks such as the Type 10 modern tank, this museum is also interesting because many Japanese soldiers actually visit the museum in group, which allows the public to meet person they would not normally meet in general. And the exchange here are quite interesting. It goes from what are their favorite ration food to tryout of military equipment such as parachute and combat gear. The tone of the museum is also something to be noticed. I think it is not very serious, to say the least, as Japanese Self-Defense Forces enjoy using mascots and the staff is quite friendly and open to jokes. And for some this can be quite not controversial but problematic because it gives an image of army being extremely relaxed and cool, which has led to many people enrolling for the wrong reasons. Even though for Japan it is not very important, as Japanese Self-Defense Forces have difficulties in recruiting, still that makes for an interesting experience and especially informative for an army that, despite its colossal budget, is not well known by its own public but also international public. There is another museum interesting to see, not dedicated specifically to Japanese Self-Defense Forces, but Japanese aviation in general. In Tokorozawa you can find a memorial garden with a museum inside that displays Japanese aircrafts. And what's interesting, contrary to other aircraft exhibition, is that none of these planes are armed, mostly training fighters or recovery helicopters. This place is quite important for Japan, as Tokorozawa was one of the first airbases of Japan. And in the memorial garden you can even see a statue of the French officer that helped Japan gaining its first air force after the end of First World War. To conclude, if these museums are not a must-see for a first visit in Japan, at least they give enough information to understand how Japanese see military today. A mix of fascination for innovation, but also a reminder that Japan is a fully armed country. To conclude, Japanese Museum of War help us understanding how Japan see war. On one hand, you have a celebration of Japanese glorious past, victories such as the Battle of Tsushima. On the other hand, you have some kind of revisionist tension related to the insatisfaction, for example related to Tokyo trial. And on the last hand, there is a dedication to peace in two forms. For a abolition of nuclear weapons, but also a reminder that Japan can defend itself through Japanese Self-Defense Force Museum, for example. All of these types of memory creates conflict and, most importantly, creates vicious circles between Japan and the countries it had war with. This creates then an endless circle where Japan is asked for apologies. Japan then creates apologies in certain form, but those apologies are not accepted, especially by China. And at the end of the circle, this makes Japan being extremely tired of apologizing all the time, thus making it appears as more revisionist than it is. And even if there are revisionist tension in Japan, most Japanese historians are in line with other foreign historians related to topics such as Second World War. Still, for countries such as China and South Korea, there are open doors possibilities. This has been shown in reconciliation between France and Germany, but also between Poland and Germany. It is fully possible to create a narrative that encompasses both countries. However, this requires a very strong political will, but also economic interests, which had been the case between France, Germany and Poland. And this could be the case, for example, between Japan and South Korea, who are promoting more solidarity, especially with the new Lee Jae-myung presidency. However, this open hand on the South Korean side will also require an open hand policy on the Japanese side, which is currently pending as I'm writing this video, with Japanese Prime Minister election being held in a few weeks. The next years will, in that case, be very crucial towards memorial peace between Japan and South Korea. Concerning the Chinese case, for now it is pretty difficult, and I don't see much opening in the future, especially as China and Russia are being closer in their memorial narrative related to Japan. I cannot sadly predict future, but I hope this episode was interesting to you, and as always, I will post a new video in the near future.